I work in the San Joaquin Valley, right about where that X is, right about where there's an awful lot of wells that have an awful lot of nitrate. As Till said, most of these dairies are free-stalls with flush systems. Most of them grow corn silage in the summertime and winter forage in the wintertime. Almost all of them use some sort of surface irrigation, either border check or furrows, and the water comes from an irrigation district usually, or there's a lot of groundwater pumping, especially the south of the valley, and a couple of them pump from rivers. Much of the manure is handled as a liquid, which is land applied by blending with fresh irrigation water. I started working on this about 25, 30 years ago. And using this as a fertilizer source, it was obvious very quickly that it's a variable fertilizer source. You don't have time to get a sample to come to the lab, so and depending on where you pull it out of the pond, it's going to have different concentration, and it changes even over the course of an irrigation. So we developed a quick test for nitrogen that will tell us, will tell us in about 5 minutes what the ammonia and estimate the organic nitrogen concentration, and it works real well, so you can just pull your sample and figure out what you're doing. And then we're going to inject specific amounts of this lagoon nitrogen into the freshwater irrigation, just like it was an anhydrous tank. That's the idea anyway. And growers installed a metering run, which consists of a flow meter, a throttling valve, a sampling spigot so you can get your sample. And what we developed was this chart that guys carry around in their pickup, which you say you want to put out 50 pounds of nitrogen. You use the 50 pounds of nitrogen chart. You figure out what your concentration was, and you know how long it's going to take you to irrigate. And at the intersection, it tells you where to set your flow meter, so that you tell the irrigator, turn this valve until this flow meter reads that number, and you know you're putting out 50 pounds of nitrogen. And I had quite a few guys actually doing that during that time, but I'll back up a little bit. We wanted to check and see if this actually really worked. It was a great system. I took a couple of fields that were ringed with monitoring wells, and I went back on one of these fields. I went back and reconstructed what their manure practices had been for the past few years prior. The guy had kept really good records and hadn't thrown them away, which was nice. So to read these charts, this is the organic form of nitrogen. The ammonia form of nitrogen, we have both of these in the lagoon water. It tells you the proportion. And then the green is how much crop removal there was. So you can see that prior to this study, it was just a disposal operation. And the thinking at the time was that there really wasn't any fertilizer value to the lagoon water. So we were going to use commercial fertilizer to actually fertilize our crop and just dump the manure out. And that's how it was just done, as a disposal operation. Well, obviously the groundwater nitrate was very high at that time. I took over the field about in 1998, the corn crop, and we started to actually put out, we didn't know how much nitrogen we get from the organic, so we ignored it and pretty well just ran it off of the ammonia nitrogen for the first couple of years. And the groundwater nitrate actually started to come down, and then but we knew that it wasn't coming down enough, and we were still putting out way too much total nitrogen. This tells you the amount of nitrogen over crop removal that we applied. So here we got it down to only 2 pounds. This one we hit it exactly the same. And we got the nitrate down to about 25. When it had been running around 100. We were really feeling pretty proud of ourselves, temporarily. So here's one where we screwed up and put out too much on the winter crop and then had to irrigate the corn crop early. You can immediately see this spike that happened. It took us a while, a whole year, to get it back down again. But something else was happening at this point. We were starting to lose yields, and we ran out of funding for the project. So we weren't out there all the time. I didn't have my crew out there doing all of this, and the grower kind of took it over. And the yields were going down, and the pond started accumulating solids. There was the organic nitrogen. We had tried to assume that a lot of the organic nitrogen was coming out, and it wasn't, so we had to have more organic nitrogen be not counted. And so, conclusions from this study. Is it up yet? Okay, so this is plotting yield against the amount of nitrogen, total amount of nitrogen applied. For the winter forage, it didn't make a whole lot of difference how much total nitrogen we applied. We got about the same amount of yield. On the corn, okay, all right, so in 1998, we got great tonnage, but we put on a lot of nitrogen. 1999, we still got good tonnage, put on a little bit less nitrogen. 2000, we got great tonnage, pulled the nitrogen down to just about where we ought to have been, and then that's when the whole thing started falling apart, because in the next year we put on the same amount of nitrogen, got horrible tonnage, and then we decided we better bump that up some. So in 2002, we got it back up, but we put out too much nitrogen, and then brought it back. In 2003, the tonnage went down. So are you starting to see a trend here that in order to get any decent yields, we've got to put a lot of nitrogen on if we're using just manure sources? Okay, so that was the take-home lesson from that one. Here's another field where I knew I was running off of a safety net of a lot of backlog of organic nitrogen that had been in the soil. So I got a field where it came out of walnuts and it had no history of manure. And I thought, okay, let's see if we can grow this crop using just manure nutrients and not contaminate the groundwater. We started off with very clean groundwater, and I couldn't get the yields up. No matter how hard I tried, I still couldn't get the yields up, even when we put on a little bit more nitrogen. But in the meantime, I was trashing the groundwater. Finally, the grower said, I can't let you have this field anymore because the yields are too low. He took it over, overloaded the system with lots of nitrogen, got his yields up, and continued to trash the groundwater. So that was a fail. So, conclusions from 10 years of field work. Tools to apply targeted rates of lagoon water worked. The growers loved them. They were able to put on the amount that they wanted. I had a lot of guys actually doing this system. But decreasing the amount of nitrogen applied did reduce the amount of nitrogen in the groundwater, but, go back, wait a minute, wrong way. But we couldn't maintain the yields when a high proportion of the nitrogen was in the organic form, and we also had a lot of leaching losses in the system. So now enter the regulations right about this time as I was finishing up this study, and what are we finding? The recent regulations limit the nitrogen application to 100 for 40% of crop removal, and lo and behold, the growers' experience is just like mine. So they have to include all sources of nitrogen, commercial fertilizer, nitrate in the irrigation water, legume plowdown, atmospheric deposition. All of these sources have to go in, including the organic nitrogen. So what's happening? Just what happened to me. The guys who are trying to do it right are getting horrible tonnage. And clearly it's because of lack of nitrogen. The next door neighbor who who underreports and puts out what he needs is getting great crops. Just what I found. Okay, so what I have heard people say is, all right, well, if you can't maintain yields, it's more important to protect the groundwater quality, so you're just going to have to live with lower yields. Okay, let's try that. We have a certain amount of cows, they have a certain amount of nitrogen that they produce, and we're going to put that on the right amount of corn, right? Okay, so we're going to fertilize for the yield that we expect to get. But suppose we don't get that yield. Then what happens to the extra nitrogen that we applied in order to get that yield? Well, that winds up in the groundwater, okay? So it's like, okay, all right, so that didn't work, so we know we can't get that tonnage, so let's cut it back even more. So this time, we're going to put on the amount of nitrogen to get a lower yield, right? Haven't changed our cow numbers, but, you know, all right. Okay, but if we don't get those yields, that's going to go to the extra is going to go to the groundwater. And we have driven our dairy operator out of you're no longer profitable, and you have not done anything to protect groundwater. Okay, so the yields are really important to maintain profitability. There's lots of reasons why you need to maintain the yields if you're going to make this work. Why is it so difficult? We have organic nitrogen that, and the slides, okay, that becomes crop available over time. It's temperature driven. If we superimpose that over what the crop needs, we have these tremendous needs on a short period of time. In order to hit that, if we superimpose that, then we're going to have you have to put on a lot of manure in order to hit these peaks. And the slides are not changing. Come on. I'm hitting the button and nothing happens. Okay, so in order to hit these peaks, you have to put on a lot of manure, but you can't turn it off when you don't have a crop to take it up. So that's why it doesn't look so good. The other problem that comes in is we did this study where we used where we put the lagoon water out on some checks and not others and compared the difference and how fast does it come out. And right after we put it out on the pre-irrigation, we had this amount of nitrogen that was coming from the lagoon water. Okay, about 3 weeks later, we had a lot that came out from the soil, but we had less. We couldn't even find some of the manure nitrogen that we had originally got. So we were getting either immobilization or denitrification. If it's immobilization, then we get it back. If it's denitrification, we don't get it back. Growers have been telling me that when they use commercial fertilizer, they know what response they get. They put out lagoon water nitrogen, ammonia nitrogen, and they don't get the same response. So I don't even know how to tell my growers how to use the ammonia part of the lagoon water nitrogen, let alone the organic part. It's problematic, and this actually happened also in when we tried the same thing with corral manure, same kind of a deal. So another thing that's a factor is that we're losing in every irrigation 8 to almost 500 pounds of nitrogen in one irrigation through leaching. So if you can't hold the nitrogen in the soil, this makes it a really difficult situation to manage. I'm not totally discouraged yet. What I think we have to do is, first of all, we have to get a handle on the worst of the leaching. So we have to reinvent surface. I want to reinvent surface irrigation so that we can. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be way better than it is. And I think we can do that. No one's really looked at surface irrigation. It's much more sexy and you get more grant money to do drip irrigation, but you put a drip system, putting manure through a drip system, there's just a lot of issues. You know, it can be done, but for the average dairy farmer who doesn't know what his next milk check is going to be, to marry yourself to a system that has such high inputs, it's like, it makes me really nervous. Okay, so I would rather take their 70-year-old irrigation system, tweak it so that it actually functions well, and take a little bit of groundwater recharge with my irrigation. Okay, and I think that if we can, and then we're going to spoon feed the crop so that we put out just the right amount of nitrogen. And we're going to model the system and put that model in the hands of the grower so that he can figure out how to strategically time those applications to match his crop uptake, and also keep track of all the different things he has to keep track of, all this irrigation water. We need to have some sort of record-keeping system that works for these dairy operators who are either a big grower that is really kind of disengaged with the actual irrigation, or a smaller operation that doesn't have time to do all of this in-season record keeping. Of course, they have to have the right infrastructure, and that takes engineering, and some of these systems were designed for disposal, and we have to redo the pipelines. There's a lot of things that have to change. It's not going to be easy, but it is possible to do this. We have to take a hard look at, do we have the infrastructure to actually pull this off? And we need decision support so that guys know what they're doing. We have to put the dashboard on the car so that they actually know what they're doing. I think we can get it. We're never going to get it down to 10, but I'm betting that we can get it to something a whole lot better than what it is.
Awesome. Thank you very much.